Continuing with the sources of distortion in the West image of the Middle East, in this segment I want to talk about 9/11 because that event, probably more than any other event, helped shape our contemporary view of the Middle East. That day, 9/11, has been called the day the world changed. It is arguably, as I mentioned, the most defining event in terms of how Americans especially view political Islam, view the challenges from the Middle East, and also, in this context, what ought to be our new role in the region in terms of influencing the direction of change and politics of the country. However, in a broader scheme of things, that is, in terms of international politics, the question still remains, how salient was 9/11 as far as the rest of the world was concerned? On the one hand, the sheer audacity of the act itself was really unprecedented. So was the magnitude of the global shock it generated. The United States and her allies have had to bear huge cost in responding to the 9/11 attack. Today, more than a decade after that tragic day, there are no signs that the status quo ante that prevailed prior to 9/11 attack can be restored. So all of these facts confirm the claim that 9/11 changed America as we knew it. What it did was to rejuvenate the national security state mentality that first really became manifest during the early years of Cold War in around 1947. It shifted our domestic and foreign priorities, perhaps for decades to come. It changed our domestic security regime by enhancing the surveillance powers of the government to invade our privacy. The global war on terror has also been a very costly proposition. In June 2011, the Time magazine reported that a group of academics who were very experienced in estimating the cost of the war believe that, contrary to the Pentagon's claim of $1 trillion, the actual cost of the war on terror is closer to around $5 trillion. To get a better understanding of what that means, it translates to around $16,000 per every American, or around $64,000 for a family of 4. And aside from the monetary cost of the war on terror, in responding to 9/11, Americans grew less liberal, less tolerant, especially toward the Muslim. And yet, even though for the United States, 9/11 attack was a transformative event, for the remainder of the world, the event, although undoubtedly tragic, nonetheless was not a world-transforming happening. The world goes about its business pretty much as it has done since the end of the Cold War. The functioning of international institutions, international organizations, and NGOs have not been dramatically altered because of 9/11. True, NATO got dragged into such areas as Afghanistan, an area whose mission never had called for. But then, before 9/11, it did get dragged into Kosovo and Bosnia. Be that as it may, sectarian and ethnic conflicts in Africa and Middle East and parts of Asia, and conflicts associated with weak or dysfunctional governments continue to define the post-9/11 world, just as they did in the pre-Cold War era. And all of these are really not that surprising. After all, Al-Qaeda is neither a state, nor is it an ordinary terrorist cell. It is, in fact, a transnational insurgency organization consisting of a loose networks whose primary targets are the United States and United States close allies in the West and the Middle East, not just the West. So Saudis would be part of that target. So despite the sudden and wholly unexpected nature of the 9/11 attack, the truth is that the main ideas behind 9/11, but not necessarily its specific format, its specific means to carry that out, these ideas have been brewing for some time, and in essence, what they represent is a kind of a payback for the United States policies toward the Arab Middle East and toward Islam. The attack itself was really several years in the making. I tried to discuss some of that in my manuscript that you will be reading, but it goes back to 1993, the first attempt at the World Trade Center, the truck bombing that occurred, killing a few people, and then you could see it's going to be, the target's going to be in American Embassy in Nairobi and Nairobi, Kenya, and also in Tanzania. And then the attack on the USS Cole, and finally 9/11. So the 9/11 was not something that just happened. It was in the making, and it was primarily in response to the years of American policies in the region. That said, for me, the most disheartening, the most disappointing part of post-9/11 period is this: how this tragic event had virtually no impact in compelling us, the Americans, to reflect thoughtfully, critically, and re-examining seriously our policies in the region. There really were no serious and sustained debates about U.S. policy in the aftermath of 9/11. Again, in the manuscript, I point that out in greater detail. In fact, what we had instead was that those questioning the wisdom of United States policy over several decades, or those who voiced disagreement with the premises of the global war on terror, were instantly rebuked and charged as being unpatriotic. Indeed, the ferocity with which those of us who called for a national debate over our response to 9/11 were attacked seemed like a replay of the McCarthy-era witch hunts of the mid-1950s during the height of the Cold War. So, to sum up, in the wake of 9/11 tragedy, instead of re-examining our past deeds and acts, we adopted an ahistorical posture and treated 9/11 as if it had suddenly sprouted out of nowhere and that it simply had to be eliminated. So as a result, our policies after 9/11 was really more of the same. But now it was being complemented by a heavy reliance on our military in order to help us pursue what I believe are unachievable and mostly illusory objectives. The outcome of these policies were therefore predictable. Look at the wars in Afghanistan, which was followed by a second war in 2003 in Iraq. They were all direct consequences of the global war on terror. So these two wars were part of this global war on terror that was initiated under President George Bush. And as I said, they hardly have achieved the kind of objectives that was assumed they were going to achieve. The final factor influencing the image of the Middle East that we have of these people is the Arab awakening. And that is a topic that I will address in much greater depth when we get to it. But certainly the Arab awakening has forced us to rethink our image of the Middle Easterners. However, I must say it is not the kind of a rethinking that we normally associate with critical reflection. Some of us interpret this as they're finally coming back to understanding what we've always been preaching them, and that is they need democracy. Forgetting that actually our role has been to help most of the dictators in the region because they were our close allies, and we have prevented them from achieving democracy perhaps earlier. So Arab awakening is something that I'm going to address later on in much greater depth. So I want to now make some conclusion regarding what we have been saying about the sources of distortion we have in our imagery of the Middle East. Let me end by noting that in many ways, like Britain, and to a lesser extent France and Russia, the United States has been a major source of disturbance and instability in the Middle East. And it's ironic that like all other imperialists or other colonialists, we have adopted the same role. We create instability in order to establish our hegemony, but once the hegemonic order is established, we all yearn for stability. In other words, stability has been our mantra because we wanted to protect our interest in there. So it's one of those ironies that the imperialists, the colonialists are the source of instability, they're the source of disturbance, but once they conquer it, all they want is a stability. And yet the region is thirsting for change. So the proposition that I like you to reflect upon is this. You cannot understand post-World War II Middle East without taking into account the United States' role and policies in the way they have impacted the development of the region. By all accounts, it has been a chaotic policy. And ironically, we may be in the midst of a major strategic shift. In other words, even though we tend to think that Middle East is going to be our backyard, what's happening now with us is that under President Obama, we are, or it seems that way, we are preparing to switch our focus away from the Middle East toward Asia and Pacific because we sense a new rival. That new rival happens to be, of course, China. So it looks like events rather than conscious policy is forcing us to do what we should have done many years ago, and that is to end our military presence in the Middle East. The main conclusion that I like to draw from discussing the sources of distortion in our perception of the people of the Middle East is that most Americans know very little about the Middle East and its people, and what they know is often encapsulated in a distorted imagery of the area.